Cold War by Simon, Calix, and Dakota. What was the social, political, and cultural impact of the Cold War period in each of these regions or nations listed above? United States. The Cold War had a lot of effect on the United States. Crude oil production in the U.S. was slowed, which led to Russia overtaking them as the largest oil producer. This also led to gas shortages in the U.S. alongside with heavily increased gas prices. The Cold War had a cultural impact on the U.S. by putting a fierce rivalry on all sporting events that the U.S. and Russia competed in. Thomas Merton lived through the Cold War and wrote his opinions on the war and what life was like for the average American living through the Cold War. He believed that the war was not worth it for America and that it was better to try and do things peacefully, and he endorsed nonviolent and civil disobedient movements. His life was changed by the war due to rising shortages in some products that were before supplied by Russia. It also put some fear into his life by the threats of atomic bombs being dropped on America. This led to bombing drills being practiced in school. Eastern Europe. The political effects of the Cold War on Eastern Europe was communism. Russia became a communist country, and children were made to attend classes. Stalin took control of all of the media citizens would see and controlled what products that people would use. Culturally, Stalin made being a traditional family more important. He limited divorces. He also expanded healthcare, but proper housing and food for the people remained an issue. Western Europe. Western Europe was affected during the Cold War politically by being supported by the U.S. The U.S. helped to rebuild parts of the Western Europe that needed help. Western Europe remained capitalist as stayed away from the Soviets' rule. Culturally, Western Europe changed by gaining more American influence in the form of restaurants and other American cultural being integrated in the culture that was already previously in Western Europe. Latin America. Latin America was not greatly affected by the Cold War. The U.S. tried to remain in the influence over the region, but it was near impossible. Civil wars within the region happened frequently. The main civil war created by this war, the 36-year-long Civil War in Guatemala, Latin America, remained culturally similar to before the war occurred. Africa. Africa was used during the Cold War as a possession. Both the U.S. and the Soviets tried to possess Africa. Africa contained many important resources that were used by both nations during the war, like oil and precious metals. This hindered political and economic development in Africa. This also stopped lots of countries from gaining independence. Middle East. The Middle East was mainly used during the Cold War for its oil reserves. These oil reserves were incredibly important and could be a great help to help fight in the war. It was important for both nations in the war to get on this good side of the Middle Eastern nations due to their position in between four major seas. Culturally, the Middle East was not affected very much though. India and Pakistan. India formed a strong relationship with the Soviets during the Cold War, and they were a tool that was used by the Soviets to help get an edge over the U.S. Pakistan allied themselves with the U.S. during most of the war. Pakistan was also the leader of important treaty organizations which helped the U.S. throughout the entire war. East Asia and the Pacific Rim. East Asia played a part in the Cold War by forming relations with the U.S. and the Soviets and provided useful resources to both nations and cheaply products that provided both nations with things they normally wouldn't be able to get. Did democracy ultimately prevail in each place? In other words, did the U.S. win? Democracy is to some extent inherently inefficient. It has always been tempting for nations to avoid the group decision messiness of parliaments, congresses, and assemblies. All the more so today because of the increasing complexity of our globalized society. Mass immigrations, terrorism, transnational criminal activity, and the international economic upheavals bring a longing for order that can play on false memories of simpler times. The United States is a representative democracy. This means that our government is elected by citizens. Here, citizens vote for their government officials. From the late 1770s new constitutions and bills explicitly describing and limiting the authority of power holders, many based on the English Bill of Rights in 1689, historian Norman Davies called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Constitution of May 3rd, 1791, the first constitution of its kind in Europe. Democracy became widespread in Western Europe with the further developments of suffrage, ministerial responsibility, and parliament. After World War II, the Soviet Union sequestered most of Eastern Europe behind an iron curtain of the communist rule. Then, in 1989, popular discontent toppled communist governments in rapid succession. Today, 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, most of the former communist nations are functioning democracies with free elections and multi-party political systems. In the former Yugoslavia, however, ethnic religious rivalries have spawned bloody conflicts and thwarted efforts by the United States and NATO to help establish peaceful democracies. Elsewhere, in Eastern Europe, however, democracy appears secure through the public, and many of the countries are unhappy with the specific policies. Democratic elections had rocked Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Nicaragua, Paraguay, and Peru. Eventually, Panama, El Salvador, and Guatemala would follow. But 1999, only two nations had resisted democracy's lure. One was Castro's Cuba. The other was Mexico, which had been in the grip of a single party for much of the 20th century. A year later, in 2000, with the overthrow of the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, Mexico became one of Latin America's most exemplary democracies, sending its citizens to voting booths every 6 years in orderly elections. As governments across the continent became, with some expectations, more authoritarian, Africans will be increasingly alienated from those claiming to represent them. Political instability can manifest itself in severe episodes of violence, as is already being seen in Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Nigeria. Such turmoil will grow as elites compete for power, and citizens resist oppressive regimes, and will, in turn, inhibit social and economic developments to the disadvantage of the continent's rapidly growing population. Taken together, these forces also drive internal displacement and outward migration both to other African treaty countries and to Europe. Addressing these issues will require grappling with long-standing grievances left untreated and often exacerbated by the poor. Sometimes, brutal governance is all too common sense across the African continent. The level of democracy in nations throughout the world, published by Freedom House, a U.S. government-funded advocacy organization, and in various other freedom indices, report the Middle Eastern and North African countries with the highest scores are Israel, Tunisia, Turkey, Lebanon, Morocco, and Jordan. While it was categorized as democracy aid, it wasn't necessarily meant to promote democracy. Democracy entitles alternation of power. Most NGOs that received Western assistance avoided anything that could be constructed as supporting a change in regime. In Pakistan has oscillated between the military and democracy. After several years of each kind of regime, due to unmet expectations or perceived failures, public opinion has tended to tire of it and to turn back to the other. But after Ashuri's followed regime that ended up in 2008, Pakistan appeared to have made a more solid shift to democracy. In a June 2016 Gallup poll, 84% of respondents said they preferred democracy to dictatorship. Yet Sharif's disqualification last month by the Supreme Court after a month-long hearing on his unexplained assets leaked by the Panama Papers was in a part a response to the conviction and popular opinion that he was corrupt. The military, on the other hand, continues to be considered non-corrupt and efficient. The great struggles of the 20th century become between liberty and totalitarism ended with a decisive victory for the forces of freedom and a single sustainable model for national success. Freedom, democracy, and free enterprise. In the 21st century, only nations that share a commitment to protecting basic human rights and guaranteeing political and economic freedom will be able to unleash the potential of their power, of their people, and assure their future prosperity. People everywhere want to be able to speak freely, choose who will govern them, worship as they please, educate their children, male and female, own property, and enjoy the benefits of labor. These values of freedom are right and true for every person in every society, and the duty of protecting these values against their enemies is common calling of freedom-loving people across the globe and across the ages. How can the present conflict between the West and East over Ukraine destabilize each of these regions? The present conflict between the West and East over Ukraine will destabilize these regions by threatening the stability of Europe, but it has also impacted food and energy security globally, including in the Middle East and Africa. These issues are creating shockwaves to a world still recovering from the COVID-19. Ukraine has played for a long time an important and sometimes overlooked role in the global security order. Russia's invasions of Ukraine in February 2022 marked an enormous escalation of the 8-year-old conflict that began with Russia's annexation of Crimea and is shown as a significant turning point for the European security. A total of almost 5 million refugees have been shown to have escaped to many different European countries, and almost 30 million illegally crossing the borders into different countries, causing a mass influx in people. Is Western democracy weaker in this new Cold War than it was in the first? Western democracy is weaker in this new Cold War than it was in the first because the invasion of Ukraine was a huge blunder. This Europe feud makes pools of customers for Russian trade not durable alliances and a less structural model of economic and political development to rival liberal democracy. Putin increases his influence by pumping disinformation into Western digital debates and dirty money into election campaigns. The plunder of natural resources, suffocation of dissent, and scapegoating of minorities have made the country weaker and poorer. Is Western democracy weaker in this new Cold War than it was in the first? The threat is all the more acute when the economic model that has underpinned democracy is also failing. British wages have been stagnant or falling in real terms since 2008. The 20th century promised that children would grow up to enjoy higher living standards than their parents is broken. Liberal democracy offers social advancement through merit and hard work. The only reliable conveyors now are inheritance and luck.